So we wanted to open it up and also look at the format so that people can, feel free, like if they have topics that they want to go over, whatever, they can too. So we made this more of a drop-in type thing too. So thank you all for being here. And if there's anything you want to make sure we talk about today, if you can put it in the chat, then we'll do that. We are going to go over, we're going to start with the blog about MYPAC and wraparound, just to make sure everybody understands the terms and kind of what's going on and what the chances, what your opportunities are to give input. So, and if there's something, I think we've got this in webinar format because that helps us not have Zoom bombers. I'm not sure. So it may be that if you want to be unmuted, you may need to put that in the chat if you want to talk that way. Okay. And if there's something, you guys probably know this from all the many times you've been on virtual things the past year and a half, but where you go into chat where it says, like right now mine says everyone, you can put like just the person you want to talk to, or if you want to send me a message or whatever, you can do that. I don't know everyone who's on here. If you're a parent who has questions about your, I'm sorry you're having technical difficulties, Linda. If you have questions about your particular situation with your child, we are recording this, so we can either turn off the recording, or if you want to talk with us afterwards, we can stay on, or you can call us. But I just don't want to put you in a position where anything would be difficult for you. So you can send that message to either Karina or me. And if there's anybody who doesn't want this recorded, you can send that message to me too, and we'll turn off the recording. The reason we record it is so for people who couldn't be here, who want the same information, so they could get it. We're not trying to get anybody on record or anything. And we'll, I think we'll look at, I'll find out whether or not it's shared with or without the chat. All right, so welcome everyone. I'm Joy Hogge with Families as Allies. And like I said, this is the first time we're doing this particular way. And so y'all can also let us know what you think of this format and this idea of just getting together to discuss different policy things. I don't see anything chat yet about specific things people were wanting to talk about. So we can go ahead and start with that blog, because I think it's something that's been a little confusing for people, and go from there. And I do see Christy Plotner on here. We're going to talk about some of the history behind all this. So you can help me out on that part, Christy, or any other part, or anything that anybody wants to help with. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with this. There have been some changes and different things, and everybody should be able to see my screen where I have the MYPAC blog up. So if anybody's not seeing that, let me know, or let Karina know. There's been some different changes with MYPAC, which is Mississippi Youth Programs Around the Clock, since probably about May or June. And it's gotten kind of confusing to follow. So we want to go through those, and especially give families whose children might be in MYPAC or have received MYPAC, or they think might want to receive MYPAC, the information that you would need to understand this like on a practical level, so that if you, there's not right now, but soon there should be some policies that are open for comment, so that if you want to give public comments about how those policies can be as helpful as possible to children like yours and families like yours, that you'll have the chance to do that. Because everybody should have the chance to give input into how things are set up. And sometimes as a parent, it can feel like, well, these big policies they do at the state level, that's not really going to affect my child. But actually they can, because the way policies are set up can be either family driven or not family driven, just like anything else. But the only ones who are going to be able to give that kind of feedback about what's most helpful to families are families. And then if you have, you know, a child who understands, you know, at a level where they would want to give input to, they can too. So we're going to go through that. And I'm just going to read through some of these things so that we'll know where we are. The thing that's happened most recently is the Mississippi Department of Mental Health. So that's the agency that oversees and sets standards for public mental health services in Mississippi's certification standards. Has put out some standards for the providers. So the providers are the people who actually provide the service for MYPAC. And those are temporary. They're going to last for a while, just a little while. So they were put out and they're effective October 14th. And typically when an agency does something new like that, there's a time that people can give comments. But since those are temporary, there wasn't a public comment period for those, but they'll be filing permanent ones sometime fairly soon. And it will be about the standards. It'll be both what do providers who want to provide this service need to do. So there's that part, and that's what's called what's called a provider bulletin. And then there's standards that will become part of the Department of Mental Health standards about the providers who want to provide that service, how they have to go about doing it. Now, as a parent, you know, and I encourage you to look at any of these things. And when something's highlighted like this, that means we've hyperlinked it. So you can go look at the actual document. So you can see for yourself what different things say. The provider bulletin is going to be more about what the providers need to do to be able to deliver that service. The temporary standards, which would become permanent after there's a filing for permanent change is filed, and there's a public comment that'll probably be about a period of about 25 days. Those will be the standards that those providers have to go by to deliver that service. Those are probably going to be more relevant to you as a family member. So I'm going to see, and I never know when I do this, if it goes. Okay, Karina, can you tell me, are you seeing the standards? Are you still seeing our blog post?
A little bit of
The standards.
Oh, good, it worked. Okay, so these are the temporary standards, and you can look through them and just, you can see what they say. Tells you how the service is defined, who they're for, what someone has to do to be admitted to the service. So you could read this and see, you know, is this something that would even apply to my child? And in general, MYPAC services have typically been for children who would otherwise need like a residential treatment facility or treatment out in a place outside of their home, but to provide intensive enough services so that they can stay in their home. But that's spelled out here how it's being defined. Now, as you go through that, you might think, well, I think my child would qualify and this certain thing isn't in there. Those are the kinds of things you could think about if you want to comment on. And this says what would happen for it to be decided that they would no longer be in the program. So that's the discharge criteria. And this is what the providers of MYPAC services must do to be able to provide it. So they have to be certified by the Department of Mental Health. It tells you about the staff they need to have and the things they need to do. These are the required services. Now, this might be something you want to take a close look at and think, when you think about those services, are those the services that would be most helpful for you and your family? Or would there be other services that might be more helpful? And it's okay if you, and I'm not trying to put words in anybody's mouth, but like if you think, I'm not sure these are the things that would most help my family in this situation, but you're not sure what to call other things that might, you can just describe the type of support you might want. And then it talks about needs to be individualized, needs to be a plan, and then how often that if your child's in this program, how often that the people working in this program will contact your family. Now that's a part if you that I would encourage families to take a close look at, because some of the feedback we've gotten is that sometimes the frequency of visits doesn't match up with what families are most wanting. So I would look at that and just imagine, you know, if my child is going to be in this, what would work best for our family? Because you're going to know that better than anyone. And this is interesting because this is kind of a new thing. It does talk about how it coordinates with wraparound and what happens if the child's not receiving wraparound. And that's kind of a new thing to think about, because typically MYPAC has been delivered together with wraparound, which is one of the things that's been sort of confusing. We're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, now we're going to go back to the blog post. So you can look at those and just see what you think. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? Okay. Tell me if I missed something, Karina.
I will. We have nothing in the chat right now.
Okay. And this really has been confusing. And every time I go over these things, I think I get some things clear in my mind. And I'm not promising you that I or anyone at Families as Allies has this all figured out as far as what's happened when and why and what it all meant. But we have tried to follow it closely. And I think we can help you, if you're sort of coming to this in the middle of it, figure out, well, what does this really mean for my family? What do I need to know as far as my child? So there have been several changes made to MYPAC a few months. And at one point, the program was stopped altogether, but then it restarted. Okay. And that all happened mostly in May and June. And if I don't get my dates exactly right, you can put it in chat, but I think I've got that mostly right. Now, this seems like one of those dry, weird policy things, but it actually makes a big difference in how we think about this. And it took me a while to kind of have that sink into my head, but I think I get it now. All right, this is what originally led to these changes, is the need to separate wraparound, which was what we were just talking about. And we noticed in that policy that it's not assuming these two things go together. And wraparound is the care coordination process that's used by programs that offer MYPAC. So it's not the actual services, it's the way somebody sits down with the family, finds out what they want, and works with them to bring all those people together. That's wraparound. Okay, and then there's the MYPAC services that children and families receive. So that's things like the therapy, it might be peer support, it might be some sort of informal service like helping them find respite. But it's an actual service that you can see. Now, any thoughts? And the paragraph goes on to talk about this, but that was kind of a weird concept for me at first. I was thinking, why does that matter? But does anybody have any thoughts about why would there be this, any kind of need, or why would people be interested in getting those two things? Any thoughts? And they traditionally haven't been separated in Mississippi from the very beginning when everybody started working on this stuff. They really haven't been separated in Mississippi. So, but now, and it's mostly Medicaid, and it's mostly the federal agency that regulates Medicaid that's saying they have to be separated. Any thoughts, or does it just seem like an idea? Or
I can just give you from a provider perspective.
Okay, is that Rhonda Stemkowski?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
it just says Rhonda. I wasn't sure which Rhonda. Hey.
It's just me. Not really a provider perspective. When, with the changes and talking to families that are in the pre-admission stage about what they want and what they need, they may most often go with just the MYPAC service because it limits two people from coming in their home, two different people. And that's what we hear a lot from families that make it uncomfortable for them to have multiple people, not sure what to call for what service. And we do a lot of training on the front end of what each person's role is. But I don't know if that has an impact on it, but that's what we hear most often from families.
I think, and that I'm sure that is related to this, but this is the basic, and this is, I think, something kind of has to sit and simmer with. If wraparound coordinators, now a wraparound coordinator, all they should be focused on, if these two things are separated, and that's what CMS, the regulatory agency, was saying, is someone's coming in to support a family and say, what do you want? What is most important to you? Who can we put together? If they're working for the same agency that's going to provide the services, first of all, they may just, let me have a comment here.
Yeah, it's Linda. She's commenting.
Okay. Okay. And I want, and I'll put you on in just a second, Linda. I want everyone to consider this and in light of your comments. If a wraparound coordinator works for the same agency that's providing the services, first of all, there's going to be a natural tendency to just offer the services from that agency, because they're going to know that agency and they're going to know about those services. If they're saying, my only job is to help this family get whatever they want from wherever they want, they're not going to be looking just at their own agency. And in fact, if they work for an agency that doesn't provide services, some of the national research we're seeing says that that model actually works best, because then they can help that family get services from wherever. And that family can say, there's this thing I've always wondered about. And maybe there's only one place that offers a service that meets that need. It's going to be up to that wraparound coordinator to work with that family to find that service. So it opens up the choices. That's one thing. And then the other thing is, if a family isn't satisfied with services, and the person they should be able to come back to is, or maybe they just want them to be a little different, is the wraparound coordinator, and say, this just isn't working for me, or I don't think I want services from this place anymore. That wraparound coordinator is going to be in a much better position to help them change services if they're not like having to go tell a coworker, this person doesn't want to work with you anymore. And also, billing is a reality. If they're not in a position where they're telling, going to say that to their coworker, and they both have the same boss, and that boss is having to, look at billing and those kinds of things. So it prevents a conflict of interest. So that's the reason that CMS requires that. They require that wraparound or care coordination be separated from services. It's possible that an agency can do that within the agency. I don't know, but there has to be really strict procedures about how those two things are kept completely separate. Now, when wraparound and all this first started in Mississippi, we didn't really have that knowledge and things hadn't quite evolved. But I think the data is really clear on that. And we'll get to that, some of this. Now, that doesn't mean, like, if a family is already receiving services from somewhere, or if they are getting their care coordination from someplace that also offers services, they might find out about the services at that same place and say, oh yeah, those are the ones I want. But the point is, they need to have a choice, and the choice needs to be one where they're actually, every choice that they have has an equal chance of them finding out about it. So some process where even if services from that same organization are offered, then they're just as likely to find out about them as they would services from another organization.
Okay, Linda said if she can be provided a number where she can
Yeah, I
call.
don't know how to do that. I don't know on the original invite, there may be at the bottom of it. Oh, but this is a link. No, Dominic, if you can figure that out, and then, because I don't know how to do that with this drop in. But Dominic, if you know how to figure that out, and then Linda's, are you on your cell, or should he call DMH? If he figures it out.
Her mic is not working.
Okay, all right. Or if you want to put it in the chat. And then Dominic, if you can figure out a number, then you can call her. So that's important. So that's where this all came from. So again, if they're getting services from the same place, they may feel, those coordinators may feel obligated to offer services to family just from their own agencies. And if they're, and that prevents families from having all the choices that they should have. And it may make it hard for families to tell their care coordinators when they don't like services or want to switch to a different provider. So that's just the federal, again, it's the federal entity that regulates Medicaid that brought that to the attention of the state. But the more we've looked at it, the more that makes sense, because it just supports family voice and choice. Okay. Now, in order to really understand this, I'm sorry, was somebody saying something?
Hey, can y'all hear me now? Is it working?
Go ahead.
Can y'all hear me? Are you talking to me?
You can go.
Good. Okay. Well, I mean, I can shed a little bit of light. I'm sorry, I'm kind of late. I'm not late joining the meeting, but what I might say maybe, out of line just a little bit, just out of line just a little bit, because I'm kind of joining in. But I can tell y'all, how all this occurred. I got a call a day before they decided to Medicaid. Let me correct that. Medicaid decided to do away with MYPAC. I got a phone call about a day before. And so at that point, my team and I and my supervisor began planning for what would happen with these kids who need these clinical intensive services. And so what we did was we started working with our MSERT teams and got them training through Liz Manley, who's excellent. We had 2 rounds of training for those MSERT teams on children and youth and how to respond to crises, because we knew that was such an invaluable service within MYPAC about the 24/7. So we started working with them. We also started looking at our providers, seeing what service would most closely fill that gap should MYPAC actually go away, which we felt like at that point it was gone. So what we did was we looked at I-Court and thought, well, we can encourage, providers to, apply for that service. We hadn't had a lot of interest in that service, but we started getting a lot of phone calls about that service. So we continued to work, continued to train our MSERT teams, and then later on, we received another phone call from Division of Medicaid. I don't know what transpired in those weeks and months, but we received another call from Medicaid requesting that we develop standards for MYPAC. And so our leadership worked with leadership over at Division of Medicaid, and the standards were developed.
Okay.
They are different, very different than the standards that were there previously. They are more stringent. They are more intensive. They may likely get more intensive. I don't know, based on comments that we received from providers and from the public during the public comment period that will be offered.
Okay. Thank you. And Linda, I'm sorry, but could you maybe finish up in about a minute so that we can go through the rest of this?
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Hogge, I sure can. I wanted everybody to understand how all this came about. Wraparound, from what I understand, from what Division of Medicaid told us, wraparound and due to CMS, wraparound and MYPAC cannot be provided together. they really, and and this is my opinion, of course, can be provided separately. I think they can complement each other, and I think they can be provided separately. Again, we're all about family choices, and that's what's being discussed here. So in my opinion, this is just another service that's added to our array. We have a CSU, now we have MYPAC, and stepping on down from there all the way down to day treatment and just traditional outpatient services, outpatient therapy. So now we've added a service to our array to allow families to choose what best fits their family's needs and their child's needs. So, that's where we are, and that's the perspective that we're coming from with this. Again, this was something that we were asked to do, and we did it, and we're ready for public comment, and any comments that we get, we'll look at and see if it continues to work with the service. So,
Okay,
thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak.
okay, thank you. And that's one reason we wanted to talk about this, is it's such an important opportunity when public comments are open, and to help families feel comfortable in that process. And just go through how to kind of get these two things straight in your mind. Wraparound, again, is a care coordination process, and it has nationally recognized standards for how it should be done. And this state is lucky because it works with both the National Wraparound Institute and then within Mississippi, the Mississippi Wraparound Institute, that make sure that support the system and providers who provide wraparound in making sure it's implemented consistently with what we know works. And if your family's receiving wraparound, all these things should be there. It should be based on what your family wants and what your child wants. It should be individualized to you. So there shouldn't be like any cookie cutter prescription of what services you're going to get or how often they are. Based on your strengths, incorporate natural supports, be collaborative, unconditional, like you're not going to get kicked out because it's based on what you want. So it wouldn't seem to be something to be kicked out of in the community, all these things, responsive to your culture, both your culture broadly and then as a family, is based on a whole team working together. And you look at outcomes, which that makes sense with this up here. If you're looking at outcomes and like, what do you want to get out of all these things that are put together as a family, there should be outcomes. And if your wraparound coordinator is only focused on wraparound, they can help you look at, are you getting the outcomes you want? And are you getting them in the time you want? And part of that, one thing that really supports that is using what we call evidence-based practices, things that are known to work, so that the clinical services that are being provided are known to be things that help people. And now there's growing evidence that wraparound helps families and children achieve the goals they want to achieve. It can be really hard to determine that in mental health work, because things don't always look the same every time they're delivered, but there seems to be a very growing evidence base for wraparound helps people. And one thing we like is the practice of wraparound is consistent with the nationally accepted definition of family-driven practice. I'm going to switch to that for just a minute. And this is the definition of family-driven practice that's from the National Federation of Families, but it's also the definition that SAMHSA uses. So if you've ever wondered what that means, this is what it means. Now, one thing, so it talks about for individual families and for families as a whole, families should be at the table, identifying strengths, challenges. So that's very consistent with wraparound, designing, implementing, monitoring, evaluating services, supports, programs, and systems, choosing their support service and providers. So choosing whoever you want at the table with you, and partnering and decision-making at all levels. And then you can see the guiding values. So that's what family-driven means. And that's wraparound. The practice of wraparound seems to be very consistent with that. And it's also, Mississippi actually has a state law that talks about what our system of care for children's mental health is supposed to look at. And you can go to this blog on our website and click this link and see the whole law. But this is one part of what it says, that Mississippi system of care for children's mental health shall be, and it says it shall be family driven, And this is just an excerpt from the law. And these are the things it shall provide for. And then it says a comprehensive array of services composed of treatment and informal support. So it shouldn't be just about treatment. Now, feedback we tend to get is that families are much more interested in the informal supports than the treatment services. So I think that's something to look at, is that balance in whatever's being proposed there. Or you may be someone who thinks, I want my child to have formal treatment. That's important to know too. And how can things be set up so that things can be responsive to different families? So someone wraparound should have available to it. It's not going to provide the services, but it should have available to it a comprehensive array of services composed of treatment and informal supports. So that's another reason why it's important to separate those two things, so that that wraparound can look as broadly as possible to find all of those services and supports that families might want, and that are identified as best practices and or evidence-based practice. And then individualized service planning that uses a strengths-based wraparound process. So our state law, now this is applying to children who would need the services of more than one system due to the intensity of their needs and are at risk for coming out of the home. So that's who we're talking about. So we're not just talking about a child who might need to go somewhere to get some outpatient support, but that this system should provide for, individualized service planning. So not where everybody's getting the same thing, that uses a strengths-based wraparound process. So this process of bringing a team together based on what that family wants in a manner that works for that family, and using this approach of wraparound that has national evidence that it's helping families do that. Now, that does not mean that every family whose child might qualify under that definition of who this is supposed to serve, they may not want to do that. They may not want a wraparound process, but it should be available to them and explained to them in a way that makes sense to them. And wraparound should feel good. You know, a lot of times there's a scarf used to kind of as a visual for what wraparound should feel like. And you all know what it feels like when you're really cold and you wrap a warm blanket that's soft or scarf around you. It makes you feel better. It makes you feel comforted. It makes you feel supported. That's what wraparound should feel like. It shouldn't feel like somebody's strangling you with it. I mean, we've had families, talk about things, that were being asked of them that they didn't want. Part of wraparound is you should feel free to say, well, that's not really what I want, and I would rather have this. And sometimes families may not know that, but hopefully if wraparound is being done the way it should be, that would be made really clear to families, and things would be, they would have options. It shouldn't feel like someone's strangling you. It should feel like things are being brought around you in a way that is comforting. So there's also national wraparound standards, and this is important because this is probably an area where we can really grow in Mississippi and start looking at these things. There's national wraparound standards, and at Families as Allies, if you've been in any of our other stuff, we try to look at, well, is there some sort of expert definition or some sort of thing that most people have agreed on that helps guide what we should do? Because we could all say, well, I think this is a good idea, and I think that's a good idea. And that can be important, especially for planning for our individual children. But figuring out how the system should be set up and services should be set up is really helpful if there's standards that we can turn to. So there are national standards to help agencies and states implement and provide wraparound in the way it was intended. And one of these standards is that there should be a firewall. So that means this wall that nothing can get through, including a fire, between care coordination, that's the wraparound, and services at the agency level. And also in the way the state sets up wraparound and mental health services, so that the state has standards and processes to make sure that the entities providing either wraparound or services have those firewalls in place. So that's impetus is one reason why Mississippi started looking at these changes of how do we separate out wraparound from services. And so the first thing that happened, and I think this is what Linda was alluding to, is they got separated. And I think that was beginning with Medicaid. And the original idea was wraparound would be done separately and that the individual services that families needed could be purchased on a fee for service basis. And then that was reevaluated. And I don't really know why that happened. Because there was a public hearing and then and we've tried to get the transcript of that and it hasn't been transcribed. We've got the recording, but then I think about a month later, it was proposed that they would go back to some sort of all-in-one service where more than one thing can be offered at a time. But that's why that happened. And sometimes there are different ways that this can be done. Sometimes agencies completely separate wraparound and services within one agency. And typically when they do that, like looking at other states and how they've done it, because we're just starting to look at this in Mississippi. There's different staff, supervision, and locations. So it's not like I'm gonna be walking by the office of the person that a family may have just, if I'm a care coordinator doing wraparound, walking by my office mate's desk and, knowing that family just said, I'd rather not work with that person. I won't be in that situation. We won't have the same supervisor, things like that. In other instances, and this is just, they've just started looking at this, wraparound is provided through organizations called care management entities that do nothing but provide wraparound. That's all they do. So they just help families bring together those teams and help them find the services from wherever makes the most sense for that family. Initial data that's been done at looking at this at the national level indicate that CMEs, those care management entities where that's all they do, have better wraparound implementation. Like if you watch their teams, they implement wraparound more with what they would say greater fidelity to how it's supposed to be done than mental health centers that attempt to do both things in one facility. Now, that doesn't mean that's necessarily what would happen here. We don't know. But it's something to think about and something to be guided by. And also for mental health centers that are in a situation where they want their staff to be able to do both, but create that separation within, looking at how care management entities do it could give some guidance on how to do it. And then those standards also make it clear that states should also have standards and processes to make sure that agencies have the separation. Now, I don't think, and y'all are welcome to tell me if I'm wrong, it doesn't appear that Mississippi has this process in place yet, and it's not clear like what agency or agencies will ensure that it happens. That hasn't, I don't think we've gotten to that point. Now, one thing that could help is that there's an interagency coordinating council for children and youth, and that's part of that system of care statute that's supposed to help provide guidance and support, is help oversee the system of care. So that might be an issue they could look at. Like, how can we support the state in making some growing in the direction where we can make some of these changes and set things up in a way that best works for families. And then another, and I already mentioned this, another resource we have in the state is the Mississippi Wraparound Institute, because they were set up first through the Division of Medicaid, and now I think through the Department of Mental Health, that they do training on wraparound. They go around and see how wraparound's being implemented. They see where people are having struggles. They do coaching. So they have a lot of data and they're doing coaching on wraparound. They can see where some of the strengths are, where the challenges are. And a lot of the people they work with are MYPAC providers, because since that MYPAC serves children with high intensity needs, and so does wraparound, there's a big crossover. So they're familiar with MYPAC, but their job isn't to monitor MYPAC, it's to how can we do wraparound. So they've got data, they've got a lot of strengths, but there's not a clear process for how we can use that data to help us move in the direction we most need to move on. And again, that might be another area where the Interagency Coordinating Council for Children and Youth could look and say, how do we support the agencies in partnership with families bringing all this together? Okay, that's kind of a lot of stuff. Any thoughts or comments or anything that those of you who are either those agencies or Christy, I know you have been around since the beginning, anything I didn't get right or?
I think Christy had to leave. I
Oh,
think I
did
saw
she?
her where she was off the call. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, well then we won't get her historical perspective then. Okay. So we've talked a lot about wraparound. Now, it's not the process. It's not the process of the care coordination. It's a set of services. Now, it may be a set of very good services. For purposes of this, we're not really judging those services right now. But just so if you're a family member thinking about this, you can think through these things. And I tell people I'm getting old, so I've been around since the beginning with all of this. MYPAC is a set of services and they've changed over time. So they are not the same now as they were when they started, or even as they were 5 or 10 years ago. So if you hear people talk about, this is a service that has made such a difference over time, that may very well be. But it hasn't been the same service. And we'll talk about that. So, and as far as I know, there's no current national or independent evidence of those services being effective. I'm not saying they're not effective, but since they're not a established thing that's defined the same way in every state, it's not like wraparound where people can go back and look like at wraparound overall. And does it look like it's moving in the direction of being evidence-based? It does. We can't do that with MYPAC because it's not like a thing that exists everywhere. And it's not a thing that has consistently existed in the same way over time in Mississippi. But there are agencies that are doing MYPAC that have their own internal data. So, and I think this may have been submitted in writing, but it definitely came up at the public hearing in June of 2021. Pine Belt brought up, and it was pretty impressive data, that children receiving MYPAC services were less likely to require hospitalization. And then Youth Villages had data that families had shared whose children had been through MYPAC, that it helped them function better. Now, one thing to keep in mind,
Joy,
so the way we've
just
been,
to
go
speak
ahead.
on that, I know
Sure.
at least for us, you said evidence-based practices, the therapeutic services in MYPAC are driven for us by evidence-based practices that have been accepted into Families First. So I don't know about other agencies, but I know as for us, we use evidence-based practices to guide that. And I think, some of the other providers might as well, I'm not sure, but I know that's something that DMH wants evidence of for the application process is, what evidence-based practices you're using. So I think, I just wanted to shed some light on, just some information on that those services, at least for us, are on the Family First Clearinghouse and are considered evidence-based practices. So I don't know how DMH is regulating that, but I know that providers do have to, we also do TFCBT and ACRA, which are evidence-based practices for substance abuse and trauma work. So that may shed some light on the evidence-based practice piece, if that helps at all.
Okay, that's a very good point. So that the services that an agency provides within MYPAC, an agency who provides MYPAC, it would be important for families to look at, are those services evidence-based that they're providing within MYPAC? Correct? Is that what you're saying? And that for youth?
Correct. So the evidence-based practices, MYPAC as a whole is a set of bundled of services. So
Right.
peer support is part of that MYPAC bundle. It's evidence-based, correct? The program that you guys train on is an considered evidence-based, correct?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. So the services we provide for like the therapeutic work would also be evidence-based practices. They're evidence-based therapeutic services. So it's all bundled into MYPAC, and those are, certified, and documented evidence-based practices.
Okay. All right.
And our
That's really
staff have to all be trained on those. So I would assume that that's the same for other agencies, since it has to be listed in the application what EBPs you're using. So if that helps at all.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. That is very helpful. So that is something we can go back and add that families can look at. And then what they should be able to expect from evidence-based services. Okay, thank you. But as far as we don't have a way of looking at MYPAC, and it was implemented probably about 15 to 16 years ago. We don't have a way to go back because it hasn't always been the same to look at MYPAC over time. Like even if we could say, oh, 12 years ago, it was doing this. Well, first of all, we stopped gathering data on it after the first few years. But even if that had happened all the way along, it wasn't the same thing all the way along. So we can't judge it over time. But one important thing to be judging now is, are those evidence-based practices that are offered being implemented with fidelity and how they're working? Okay. Is that fair from what you said, Rhonda? I think that's who was saying that. All right. So this is more of the history. MYPAC began in the mid-2000s, and it was designed to provide intensive home and community-based services and supports to children and youth who would otherwise need admission to a psychiatric residential treatment facility. So it's the same population of children throughout this. That is one thing that has stayed the same. Now, and we included the original proposal for MYPAC funding. It was much broader. It included comprehensive parent-to-parent support idea. It was based on, and I remember this because I remember these focus groups. There were focus groups done with families in different parts of the state. It had this approach where parents were the ones who introduced MYPAC to other parents. I'm not sure that that ever got implemented, but that was an amazing idea. Lots of informal and formal supports in all the systems, and it had an objective evaluation process. And that was originally monitored by the Division of Medicaid, and there was a real rigorous way to monitor it. And it was also coordinated with all these system of care bodies that we had in statute. It changed over the years in part because of the way it was funded. So it originally had a much, much broader array of services, and then it became a state planned service. Now, this is what, and if this is an unfair representation, y'all can let me know. Families are now typically referred to MYPAC by mental health service providers, and it's often a provider from whom their child has received residential care. That's not surprising, because if a child coming out of residential care, they might very well need this intensity of services, and it would make sense that the provider who does both MYPAC and has that care would tell them about this. So that's common. The service array, it's not as diverse or individualized, because typically what we hear is that there's weekly in-home visits for therapy, care coordination, and parent peer support, and then medication management is offered separately. So it's not that wide array of services, and that wraparound coordination is provided, but it's almost always offered through the same organization, because that's the original model we set up. And nobody has, there really hasn't been this holistic look about how do we shift from that. And then we do have internal data from the agencies on MYPAC outcomes, but there's not an external entity that's been looking at that. Now, this is one thing to think about. Services for MYPAC have been bundled at a daily rate traditionally, and that in a way makes sense, because if a family has intense needs, you may not know which service they're going to need on any given day. Also, it may be that you're with that family for an hour, but doing other things for about 4 hours to help them with whatever's going on. So that's an advantage of bundled rates. It can also be, though, with bundled rates, you always have to look at, like, if there's a lot of a service being offered once a week for an hour, and the facility or entity is billing at the bundled rate, which is going to be higher than for that typical. If that service was offered alone, it could be tempting to repeatedly bill for the bundled rate when there was only a limited amount of service that day. I think the minimum has to be at least 30 minutes. So we've gotten some data from Medicaid looking at billing patterns and what does this tell us? We haven't, and we've asked them, because everything from them comes with, you can't share this, like, is there a way to take this information and learn from it? Okay. So MYPAC is not part of that state law that talks about how the system of care shall be. But we want to evaluate MYPAC proposals against the law to see if those proposals are consistent with family driven practice. Now, these are some things we noticed. The policy and standards, they don't holistically incorporate wraparound. And that's not to say that every family should be forced. We would never say that to do wraparound, but it's not coordinated with it. And they're based on a restricted range of formal mental health services. And to be really honest, that's currently MYPAC is. And that's something we get a lot of feedback on, that that's not really what families want. So, and it sounds like the application requires the use of evidence-based treatments, but I didn't find that in the standards. So that was another thing we noted. But I think that thing about formal versus informal services and requiring therapy is an issue that comes up with families, because a lot of times it's not the therapy that's desired, but it's the therapeutic expertise. Like, instead of the family or the child having to be in therapy, could that therapist help provide coaching using their expertise to someone else who works with a child, those kinds of things. And then how those informal services that are so important, how are those incorporated?
Joy, if I may add, because I think it's important to what you're saying. One of the things that was removed was those wraparound funds. So previously embedded in the bundled rate was wraparound funds that paid for camps, and we paid for, we were able to buy uniforms for, kids playing basketball, or shoes, or things that did help elicit those informal supports. And that has been removed. And I know as an agency, we are looking at how can we supplement that,
Right.
because it was an important part of the former MYPAC program, is that they had wraparound funds embedded. And I'm sure we will find a way to make it work. But it did, when this program disrupted, and it started back technically July 1st with this new model. But when it disrupted, I think it did make a change, but, agencies are just going to have to find a way to incorporate those informal supports for the families that choose to receive wraparound services.
And I think one thing to think about with that, and I'm just going to say this for a minute because I want to get through this before 1, and we've got 4 minutes, but I don't think those were taken away. I think the money was incorporated, moved to the fee that's paid, because the fee for wraparound coordination per month, I think it's like, I forget what it is exactly, but it was a good rate. That was one thing we were really concerned about. So I think it's that those services may be able to be purchased, but it would be through that wraparound coordination process. So that's just something to look at. All right, so, and it is puzzling. We were concerned that this policy refers to MYPAC as an important service for Mississippi's children, youth, and families. It's a little odd for a service to be described as important. That's not very objective, but we don't really know, like, MYPAC has changed, so we don't know what it is. We don't know if it's an important service to children and families. We haven't found that out yet. And we don't know who decided it was important or how it was being determined. And I don't know that families were part of that determination. So they need to be. So we want to help families understand these policies and regulations. So that's why we're doing this. You don't have to agree with anything I've said. We want to share more information. We don't want families to feel pressured, like if they're getting the service from anyone who's providing the service, from us, from anybody, but just to be able for families to say what they want. And these are just some things that we encourage families to think about. First of all, you don't have to agree with anyone, including us or whoever's providing your services. Also, you don't need to understand every detail about a policy in order to comment on it. It's good to have as much information as you want, and we'll help you with whatever we understand. But as a parent, you're an expert on 2 things. One, your child. So you know them better than anyone. And then you know what would most help your child. So what you think matters and makes a big difference in policy. So you know what you think will help your child. So you can comment on this policy in which you think would make MYPAC work for your family. And you can either do that by looking at, what's been written, or you can just write out, these are the things that I think would really help my child's, one of these children in this population. And this is what I think would help him. So the definition of family-driven practice includes its principles. Families and family-run organizations provide direction for policy decisions that impact funding, supports, and services, including the right of families and youth to have meaningful voice at the individual and policy level. Now, I think it's been really unfortunate at some of these junctures. I know we've been included and gotten the heads up, like this is happening, but we typically, through most of this, nobody ever asked us anything. And, this is again from the definition of family-driven practice. Family-run organizations, and that's what we are, and families should be at the table from the very beginning when all of these decisions are made. So it's not okay for two state agencies. If we're operating under the definition of family-driven practice, to do things that they probably meant well and had good intentions, but that's not consistent with family-driven. That's a provider agency-driven practice. So we encourage any family, especially if your child's participating in MYPAC, now the public comment period isn't open yet, but to think about what you want to say and what you want to share. And then at the end, we listed some things that sometimes have come up when we've been talking to families. And some of this is if your child was referred to MYPAC or wraparound, were their needs intensive enough to need out-of-home care? Because sometimes it seems like children who don't meet that level of care are being routed into these programs. It should be individualized to your child and family. If your child and family participated in either or both, were the services and how often and where they were delivered set up in a way that worked for your family? Or were you told it has to be this many services a week? It has to be in your home, those types of things. And both should support choices in your providers and other supports. We sometimes hear from families that they're told, oh, you can't have that psychiatrist anymore. You have to use ours. Or you can't do peer support over there with that person. You need to use ours, those kinds of things. So if you've had that experience, was who you wanted included. And then to look at, do we really need to be looking at what we need to do with MYPAC, or is it more strengthening what we're doing with wraparound? I don't know, but I think that's something to consider. And we have followed, these are all the blogs we've done, which is a whole bunch of stuff, but those are there. Okay, we are 1 minute past. You guys have been very, very patient. Are there any thoughts or comments? Oh, and I see some things in chat. Do children receiving wraparound have to be authorized as needing a PRT level of care? I don't know, but it seems like they should be. Oh, and I see Christy said bye. Yeah, and that's an important thing to look at. Okay, and I would, Paige, I'd encourage you to think about that assumption that if a child needs RAP and has a serious diagnosis, that they would need therapy. I think in working with families, I think they definitely need therapeutic support, but looking at, is that going to look like one-on-one therapy? I don't know. Or would it look like something else? Do we need that to be a little more broadly defined? So those are just some things to think about. Any other final thoughts? I know that was a lot of stuff. I appreciate you guys staying on here through this. Okay. Thank you guys. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. And if there's any, and I don't know everyone on here, if there's any families on here, feel free, and you want to talk any more about this or like how it applies to you particularly, feel free to. Okay, thanks guys.